Welcome to Let's Talk Rescaled, the podcast where we dive deep into the heart of justice reform. Hosted by Noa Shoshan and brought to you by Rescaled, a European movement dedicated to reshaping our approach to incarceration. In each episode, we explore the concept of detention houses instead of large prison institutions, shedding light on the voices, stories, and ideas that are transforming the landscape of justice across Europe and beyond. From policymakers to practitioners, advocates to academics, join us as we engage in insightful conversations with those on the front lines of systemic change. Helene de Vos is the Executive Director of RESCALED, the European movement for detention houses. She's immersed in the challenge of rethinking our detention systems in Europe to make them better for individuals and society. But beneath her professional role, she's still a researcher at heart. From 2013 to 2019, Helene worked as a prison researcher at the Leuven Institute of Criminology, linked to the KU Leuven University in Belgium, where she dove deep into the relationship between prison practices, policies, and the society they reflect. Her doctoral research focused on the normalization principle in Norwegian and Belgian prisons, and she later brought her insights together in her book, Beyond Scandinavian Exceptionalism, Normalization, Imprisonment, and Society. That time shaped how she sees society and still inspires her today.
Thank you so much for having me here. My name is Helene de Vos. I'm the Executive Director of RESCALED since, about 5 years now. And before that, I've been working as a prison researcher, which was actually, or the content of my research and my research findings were really led me to RESCALED, really gave me the insights that I believed we can improve things for incarcerated people, their social networks, for society. And if we can, I think we should.
Yeah.
So I did research from 2013 to 2017 and a bit longer. And then coincidentally things were happening in Belgium. Things were in the newspapers. I also wrote an opinion piece, and then I got called by Hans Klaus, and things really felt like coming together. So it felt very natural to get involved with detention houses, which aligned in some ways with what I had been observing and with my own reflections at the time. So it all felt very natural to get involved in system change. Still from, or at least I like to think that what we do is still evidence-based, or at least based on the evidence that we have. It proposes the best thing to do, and I think if there is new evidence, or if evidence is showing differently, we should also be adaptable and make sure that what we do is still the thing we believe in, that it's making society better. So yes, coming from a research background, but I really believe if there is room for improvement, it's about human rights, it's about vulnerable people, it's about society, then we should do what we can. So I'm very, very happy to be able to work on this with more talented people and so inspiring people, and have the international dimension now that really inspires and can take us steps further.
Thanks for that. I agree with that absolutely, especially on the part that you mentioned of if there's other evidence, then we need to be adaptable. We need to change our perspective, change our concept, change our daily work even. And I feel like that's also very typical, or at least that's a characteristic of RESCALED as well, as this whole learning environment. And for that reason, I think it's really important, really interesting to speak about your research as well. You mentioned it is a few years ago you did your research, but it's very interesting because I still think it's very relevant today, and it's very relevant to the work that we do at Rescaled and how we speak about detention houses, how we speak about system change. You already mentioned it. And we actually have your book here, and it's called Beyond Scandinavian Exceptionalism, Normalization, Imprisonment, and Society. And maybe for the audience, so for people, let me just show it as well, for the people who are not so familiar with the principle of normalization, this is a well-known principle to people in the field, and the normalization principle basically says that life in prison should be as normal as possible, meaning as close as possible to life outside of prison. So that has to do with the living conditions, but also kind of interactions, and that very much comes from the underlying principle that deprivation of liberty is really that the punishment is that you lose your freedom of movement, that you lose your liberty, but not all these other things. And in practice now we see that there is a harsher punishment. People who are incarcerated lose so many more things. And so that's what the normalization principle is all about. And you did this research in Norway and Belgium.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you about this as well, because Norwegian prisons, or generally the Norwegian system and also other Scandinavian countries, are often seen as exceptional, are seen as these best practices, and prisons are seen as more humane, or maybe even most humane in Europe. And I was wondering whether that was also a reason for you to do your research in Norway, or why you made that choice to make that comparison between Norway and Belgium.
Yes, definitely. I was 24, just graduated as a criminologist, wanted to, see things improve, because we had, as a student, we had some prison visits, so that theory and practice there's a big gap between theory and practice. So of course I was attracted to the most humane prisons, and of course as back then I was very interested in prisons like Bastøy, because of course I had googled this, I had heard about this. But then I was pointed to by some of the Norwegian professors in my supervisory committee. He pointed me to Leira as a very interesting example to study normalization. And I'm really, really happy that he did.
So Leira is a prison in Norway, just to...
Oh, yes. Sorry. Yes. So, actually, it's the name of a community. So it's Leira prison. It's the prison of this community very close to Trondheim, or even part of the brothers surroundings or in Trondheim. So for me, thinking about humane prisons is a little bit maybe a paradox, of course, because people are deprived of their liberty in a penal institution, very often experience inhumane situations, even if it's in a humane context. So when people say Norway, or giving Norway as most humane prison example, is very often pointed to the material conditions. And I think it's important, and that's not just me saying this, but researchers in general, there's so big differences also in Norway in material conditions. So you can look at, of course, famous Holland prison. Yes, material conditions are exceptional there for prison, but there are others as well. There are also other older buildings, much more similar to the older buildings in Belgium as well, where it doesn't make any sense to call it most humane, or there are similar struggles there. But studying normalization, or wanting to focus on normalization, so I focused on 2 Belgian prisons, 2 Norwegian prisons, and one of the 2 Norwegian prisons was Leira prison, a small, very open, a very, very different prison from what I'd seen in Belgium, but also from the other prison that I was studying in Norway. So definitely I was attracted to this idea of most humane. What I saw in practice and what I studied also with looking at the policies, the legislation, and then the different practices, of course, it needs more nuance, and it's not, from a scientific point of view, it doesn't make sense to call it the most humane prisons. It's it's a nice way for a newspaper. It doesn't teach us so much about reality or about how we are treating incarcerated people.
You mentioned material living conditions, and that also being the exceptional part or part of normalization and what is normal, and that normalization is much more than that as well. And I think that's something we agree on, or a lot of people agree on, that's not enough. It's not normal. Even life outside detention, people may have a beautiful house and have financial means, for example, but there are still so many other factors which will affect your life trajectory, your mental health, and all these things. So there's much more that we need to look into, and those material living conditions are, at least I would say from my perspective, they are a minimum requirement, one of the minimum requirements, which of course are not a given everywhere, so it's absolutely important to pay attention to those. But why would you say that Leira was so different for you, or what could you see aside from living conditions in this prison?
Yeah, I think when we speak about normalization or normalized living conditions, it is the material that comes to mind first because it's so easily visible. And I think it's important to point out that normalizing the living conditions doesn't necessarily mean improving, or has little to do with luxury. So it has to do with making them similar to outside. So of course it depends what living conditions look like outside. There is important research findings or researchers that have been focusing on what matters most in prison, what is most relevant. This research has very much pointed to the social interactions. So even in living conditions, material living conditions that are not that modern, if you have positively experienced social interaction, the overall quality of life is experienced as more positive. However, I think from the 4 prisons that I have seen, I really think normalization or prison life should be seen in a holistic way. I think if you don't have the material living conditions, which you already mentioned, but it's not about luxury, but if you don't have common spaces where you can sit together, where you can eat together, where you can spend some time in a comfortable way together, so enough space and also a couch to sit on or a table to eat, it's just the social interactions can't really feel normalized or can't really look like in any way like a normal social environment outside prison. So you need, I think, normalizing the material context should really be normalized in order to normalize in a way the social environment, taken into account also the security, of course, and also the way in which time can be used. So I think those 4 broad areas of life should be always considered together. So material conditions can support the social environment, can support the time use. If you don't have workshops, if you don't have classrooms, if you don't have an area where you can do sports, there's no way to facilitate these things, and all together are really important to get a normalized experience of the living conditions. So that's, and to answer your question, this is very much what I saw happening at Leira prison, where is not a fancy building. It's also an old building, but it's nicely refurbished. It's clearly meant to support the philosophy of how people should be living and working there. So there is the living areas. It's small scale, so people get to know each other. People use first names. That makes uniforms redundant, because you know who is staff and who is incarcerated. So the uniform doesn't add anything, any benefit. Yeah. There is also the garden center where incarcerated people and staff work together, where clients from outside, customers, can come in, buy their plants. So that's also part of the material environment that allows for normal working conditions. Working together helps normalizing how we interact with each other. It allows for people to take other roles. So if incarcerated people and staff are working together in the garden center, they're colleagues at the time. They're not prisoner and prison officer. They're working as colleagues, and customers come in, they don't know who is who, so they're just addressing staff from the garden center. So everything is linked to each other, and at Leira prison it really came together that it all makes sense. So it's not in this particular example, it's not about normalizing small parts to make things better. It's really as a holistic philosophy, and that I think is really the key to, or I believe that is why the quality of life is perceived so high in this prison, because it's consistent, it makes sense, it's meaningful to incarcerated people and staff members.
Interesting. So it's consistently applied and it's intentional.
Yeah.
As well, everything that's done has a meaning, and there is intention behind how detention is effectively organized. And we almost 10 years after your PhD, this year we've been to Leira. I've been there with you as well, as part of the Inspire project. So as well, for the audience who's listening, in the previous episodes we've talked a lot about the Inspire project as well, and what we've been doing in this project for the past year, looking into the implementation of detention houses, the kind of broader ecosystem. So looking how what and who is part of these interactions between the detention house and the community, but even broader society. And we've been looking at some inspirational practices for that. So we've been to Leira, and I think the first thing that I really noticed, or one of my very first impressions when we arrived there, was the fact that there is this garden center where customers from the community come, and it was just, you were on the premises and there's just cars coming in and out. There's people coming in and out, they're parking, they're going to the garden center with their little carts, they're making their purchase and they go. And they don't really look around, it's just another errand that they're running. And that felt really normal, because I knew beforehand that there was a garden center, but I didn't know exactly what it looked like and where you, for example, where you can kind of come in, and I could tell that it just works. It works, it's functioning, and I was okay with it. I was like, okay, this seems very natural.
I think you're pointing at something very relevant when thinking about normalization. There is the effort of normalizing things in prison, living conditions, parts of prison life. But when you bring in living conditions from outside, like customers, you're not normalizing these interactions between the customers and incarcerated. They are normal. So it's not artificially normalized.
They're real. Yeah.
This is just this is small talk. This is this is the real normal situations where you will get in, and which are really important in life after release, but it's I think certain things, both in Norwegian prisons but also in Belgian prisons, they are normal by customers coming in, which is of course in a very open setting, much easier than in a closed setting. But both countries rely on the import model, or what's in Belgium the community services that come in, which means that teachers come in and they teach in other schools and they also teach in prison, which means this is not something that, not a prison thing that is coming close to how it's done outside. It is how it's done outside. And of course there again, mainly material conditions, but also security is putting limits on what is possible, like with digitalization, with technology. It becomes hard for these teachers to teach exactly the way they would do outside, but at least their perspective is, how do I teach outside and I feel the limits within a prison context, rather than prison education that tries to come close to what it should look outside. So I think those things are really valuable, where it's not a prison thing we're trying to make look normal, but really the aspects from outside, or the other way around, of course, if possible, that you go outside the prison and you just take part in the education there, or do shopping outside, so that it's not a shop that looks like what a shop should look like outside prison, but that it is the shop with the prices outside, with the small talk, with everything around it, which is really where the whole prison dynamics and the prison logics get challenged. And that's maybe annoying for a good management or an easy management of the prison, because it needs a lot of dialogue and collaboration and compromises, but it's really the value of normalization and what's valuable for during and after release.
And I think we've spoken about best practices or inspirational practices a lot as well, and there is often this tendency to look at these best practices and copy them and paste them somewhere else with very good intentions, oftentimes with the intention to improve an already existing system, to organize detention in a more humane way. But there is experience and practice from this, but there's also a lot of literature on it. Of course, you cannot just copy an example from one place, especially one country, and paste it in another, because you're missing the context, the culture of punishment, the culture of just that society, just how life is organized, what normal life is like as well, and so many other factors. And when a certain example is copied, I feel like the question often is, sometimes it fails, or it doesn't in reality look the same way as the original practice does, and then comes the question, why is it not the same? And why don't we see that change? And I think that's where we, especially with Rescaled as well, that's why we're speaking so much about system change, because if we look at these practices like Leira, in some Scandinavian prisons and in other countries as well, they are still a minority. It's not all Norwegian prisons which function in the same way. And I think that's something interesting to discuss as well, because we even see best practices in countries where people would say, oh, they don't have such a, there's more challenges in this country when it comes to detention. They are confronted by more staff shortages, overcrowding, yet they do have 2 or 3 examples which are really, really good, but they're not the norm. What do you think about this?
I think there's different things to this question. First of all, very important to realize that the definition that you give of normalization at the beginning of this conversation is the very simple one, which sounds very simple and attractive and makes sense in a very abstract way. But when trying to implement this, it becomes clear how challenging it is to define what's normal, to define how to implement a normalization process. Who is defining what's normal? Who should experience this as normal? So normalization, in my view, is always a process, and is always relative and subjective. And relative means that it is, as I already mentioned, it's not about improving the living conditions in prison. It's about establishing the link between living conditions inside and outside. So that, of course, means the comparison of the normalization process between Belgium and Norway is a relative comparison between the relationship of living conditions inside and outside prison in Belgium, inside and outside in Norway. So looking at the living conditions in themselves doesn't say much or not enough about how normalized living conditions are. And it is true that the living standards in Norway are higher than in Belgium, for instance. So you could expect the prison conditions also a bit higher. Now that is small differences. It doesn't mean that in Belgium we're still living in or that we have the living conditions like some prisons. We do have toilets in our homes, and the basic hygiene. So that's only part of an explanation, which doesn't really count. What is really important is that Norway, and actually Belgium as well, is a strong welfare state, where you have those public services, where you have developed education, which is accessible to everyone, or should be accessible to everyone. Healthcare, that is, I mean, if you go to the doctor in Belgium, you pay for euros. Mental health care is a problem in, I think, both countries. I think most countries is really, for a psychologist, there are long waiting lists, which is really challenging. But the point, so this relative dimension of normalization means the society should be, all those services should be there in society, should be well developed, and then it makes a lot of sense to try to equal this in prison, to bring those services inside the prison. So that's one thing, that society should provide these services, and challenges in society will create challenges in prison if applying the normalization principle. So for countries, because you spoke about different cultures, different countries, in countries where you don't have this societal or don't have these services, work in a different way. It doesn't make sense to try to apply the way in which Norwegian normalization principle, but also the Belgian is implemented in practice. It won't work in very different national contexts. So that's one thing. The other thing is subjective. Is really normal in itself is a very problematic, or can be really challenged. What is normal for you is really not what's normal for me, and even we're quite similar there in our ideas of normality. So that's actually in two ways. Both someone is defining, policymakers or the prison governor or whoever is defining in a way what's normal, and there it really depends what you want with the normalization of prison life. Is if it is like more in Belgium, if you look at the underlying philosophy, it's really about the reduction of the harmful effects of imprisonment, and very much looking at prisoners' rights. So there, what's normal is the right to education, the right to work, the right to sports, cultural activities, leisure activities, the rights to visits. So it's really translated in that way. While in Norway, based on policy documents, based on the underlying, the white paper, mostly white paper of 2007, 2008, is much more, I would say, or my perception as an outsider to the Norwegian system, much more based on an idea of what is normal in Norway. What so it's much more implicit, but I had the impression that there is much more than in Belgium a shared view of what we Norwegians find normal as a lifestyle, which includes sports, which includes healthy food, which includes drinking milk. So in a way, also more disciplining, or also more closely to normalizing the person, the incarcerated person. So normalizing the conditions, and the person comes very close in that philosophy, because you're normalizing the conditions with the aim to, or in order to give the person the chance to improve himself, or to become a law-abiding citizen, to become a good neighbor. So there's much more this instrumental view, this disciplining view, which works really well, which I've also seen in Leira how it works really well, but which is a very different way of how things are approached in Belgium. So there, also the legal culture in a way really plays a role in how things work in different countries. And I think maybe it is possible to get inspiration from how things work at Leira prison, but not to just copy it. Be really aware of, there's a different philosophy, there's a different way of looking at state intervention, there's a different way of how much trust you have in the system, and how much you need the explicit rights to be able to complain in a formal way. So it's very different ways, and I think countries can really learn a lot from each other, and there's still a lot of potential. And as you say, there are so many good examples which have their own logics, but the context, the national context, the legal context, of course, but also how culture works, how country deals with people who are different. How about foreign nationals? How about people with mental vulnerabilities? Is really also a cultural thing that you should all be aware of when implementing a facility that you want to work in a certain way. So I think it's a very complicated process, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try it, and that we shouldn't learn from it, and that we shouldn't improve towards the future.
There's a lot of interesting things that you've just mentioned, and that looking at these practices is, I think for myself as well, a lot of it is understanding why things work the way they do, and reflecting on this, and especially self-reflecting. So that was a bit in the questions that you mentioned as well, is what do we want from normalization? What does it mean, normal? What is the role of punishment in our society, and how do we view that? Because I think what you mentioned was, as well as like that it's a bit normalizing the person, that more instrumental way, maybe sometimes very intrusive way, in the sense that it's very close to, you're very closely looking over someone's shoulder, essentially, even with the good intention of supporting them, but it's a very strict, maybe environment, strict process, and that is, I think, something that is up for debate as well sometimes, whether these normalized conditions and making sure that life looks the way it does outside of detention. There's often this debate and this criticism that all this is too soft. So the whole discussion on soft on crime, that we're making it too easy for quote unquote criminals, that you'll see pictures. I mean, nowadays on social media especially, there's a lot of memes with pictures, and is this a hotel or is this a Norwegian prison, or these kind of things. I have my own thoughts on this as well, based on reading evidence, but also just visiting some of these practices, and from most people that we've spoken to as well, whether these are people who were incarcerated at the time, experts who have been formerly incarcerated, but also even staff, they say, oh, this is much harder. These conditions, doing this job as a member of staff is so hard. It requires way more skills, it requires much more thinking, it requires a broadened perspective, it requires you to work on how you I guess make a distinction between what you understand from a theoretical perspective, what your values are, what your personal beliefs are, what your emotions are. It's a much more difficult thing. It's a much more difficult if someone makes a mistake, for example, doesn't follow the house rules, to say, you made a mistake, we're gonna start again tomorrow, and that's okay. It's much easier in a sense to say, okay, that wasn't okay, and there needs to be a specific consequence of it. A bit that failure of culture is, I think, much more difficult. But in your research, you also detail a lot how the people who were incarcerated in these prisons that you researched experienced this, on how difficult or easy it was.
Yes, I think it's really a mistake from an outsider to think the open prisons or prisons as Leira prison are the ones where you're most comfortable or least challenging. As you already mentioned, the punishment is the liberty deprivation. That's really the starting point for normalization. That's the starting point in European policy. So I think we should stick with this starting point. So the punishment is the liberty deprivation, and that also means all other harmful effects should be reduced as much as possible. So whether this is a punishment or not will depend on, is there liberty deprivation or not, because that's the punishment. So yes, those are all prisons. People are deprived of their liberty, so this is punishment. Is it experienced as punishment? Yes. So people do feel the liberty deprivation, and actually the more visible the freedom still is, the more painful in a way this liberty deprivation is, because you constantly see at Leira prison there are windows looking at the street, buses are passing by, this bus would take me in 15 minutes to the city center, and from there, or even to the airport, or wherever, to a boat. This is freedom out there, but I'm staying inside because this is where I am supposed to be, and this is the punishment. When they are out for, so every Tuesdays and Thursdays they had to go for a walk, nice walk, but stick to this route walk,
specific timing.
Where at a specific timing, and they could get controlled and all that, but they could see their people that were drinking alcohol, or people going out, people with their families. You're constantly confronted with the freedom that you don't have. So it's really when speaking about the painful effect of the intentional punishment, which is the liberty deprivation, it is this what is frustrating and painful in a prison like Leira, because you're constantly confronted with freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So you feel this liberty deprivation. While in closed prisons, especially after some time, people say you go into the routines, you close off, you forget in a way about what's outside.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say that's comfortable, but many incarcerated people get used to it and find their way to survive this time just by going on routine, following whatever they have to do, but close off, which means they experience many harmful effects which will make them struggle when they get released.
Mm-hmm.
But the pains they feel are not necessarily the pains of the deprivation of freedom or the deprivation of liberty. Is the pains that comes with extreme boredom, for instance, missing family, of course, missing contact, missing meaningful contact, don't have the chance of meaningful conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So it's many other pains that I would say is not the intentional punishment. It's unintentional results of being locked in a large institution or in a closed institution, in a prison institution. So it's when saying is the punishment or making the punishment harsher or less harsh, we should not forget it's the liberty deprivation that is the punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And all the other things, well, you can have your opinion about this, of course, and you can say it looks a bit like a hotel, but it's not the point, because we work in a legal framework where it is clearly stated the punishment you get is the liberty deprivation, which is implemented in an institution, but it's not stated, and the institution should look like, I don't know, like an old castle or whatever. So when talking about punishment, when talking about normalization brings the conditions as close as possible to what is normal outside, with, of course, the limitation of the liberty deprivation.
Yeah.
So it also means the reason why the normalization principle exists is because the liberty deprivation will always make it different from outside.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the point, because that's the punishment. If you're not going to punish people, then please don't send them to a prison. So, yes.
Yeah. There's a very harsh contrast for people who are in these closed large prison institutions when they are released or when they are transferred to a facility such as a transition house or a halfway house, where they do experience that. And I think based on conversations we've had with experienced experts as well, so experts who have been formerly incarcerated, speaking also about that experience of nobody asking anything from you. You mentioned that state of boredom.
Yeah.
You don't really have to work on anything because maybe the conditions don't allow it. So there is no education, there is no classroom, there is nobody's asking you to speak about your feelings or to take on therapy, and then all of a sudden you're in that place and you have to do all of that, and if you don't do that, then you're not performing well, or you're not being a good citizen in that way.
I just realized that I didn't fully answer your previous question. But yes, absolutely, this was, and I think it's an overall finding that it's experienced as more challenging.
Mm-hmm.
is as more challenging and more meaningful at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, it's the open prison, or the prison that is considered more normalized, of which we could call more normalized, is not an easy place to be. As you're saying, a transition house where you're supposed to to take part in activities to look for work. And I think it's also a bit related to what you asked earlier, when people or politicians that are more tough on crime would maybe consider this, we're making it softer we're making the punishment or the conditions softer. I think maybe not everyone realizes that, especially now in the overcrowded prisons, nothing is really happening. They're lying on their beds or mattresses on the floor, which is of course completely inhumane, but they're on their bed watching TV, smoking a cigarette or whatever. But I don't think that people that imagine harsher regimes are thinking of people lying in their beds. At least I think we would agree that it's meaningful to work, and if possible to meaningful work, not just putting things in a bag and counting and do these small little things that is something to do, but not the most meaningful thing for most people. So yes, you're absolutely right that it may look like more comfortable, a more comfortable stay, but it's not experienced as the easy way. It's challenging.
And so that there is this challenge which needs to be managed in a way. So we accept the fact that it's not an easy experience. Do you think that can be managed in a better way when you experience this way of life in detention from the first day versus what I just explained, like transferring? Could we better manage it, or is it gonna be of the same difficulty anyway? That's kind of interesting.
Yes, interesting. So you're asking, if I understand correctly, do we need large prisons for these smaller, more normalized facilities to work well, or can we replace them all? Of course, the answer will not be based on evidence because we don't know. And some people, because there's, of course, this was what I asked the people at Leira prison. Some would say yes, it is experienced differently by people that come from a large prison that know how it is to be locked up for so many hours, to have this boredom or lack of meaningful activities is really different when you come from a place there to Leira prison than when you come from freedom to Leira prison. And they said most people that come directly complain about things that they really shouldn't complain about, but they don't know how bad it can be. So this was a bit the reasoning. But some other people said, well, we all know each other. So you also feel a bit of responsibility to keep the social climate constructive, because you feel that you owe the other incarcerated people and also the staff that is helping you with finding work, with establishing contact with family again. You owe this to the others, that you don't ruin it for the others. And I remember he said, of course I'm going to work every day as is expected of me. Of course it's the rules, but I also do it because everyone has to do it. So who am I to not do it? And that's not just not to be sent back, because that was also the consequence of not working at Leira prison, but also don't be an asshole. Just, you know the others, so just play your part, keep it all right for everyone, and work towards your future. So it's really hard to say, to give the right answer. In any case, I think it will not be enough to have only facilities like Leira prison or like the other good practices, but the more open practices that I'm thinking of. It's a punishment, it's there are security risks, or some people really need, especially at the beginning, those stricter security measures, static security then I'm talking about. So there needs to be differentiation in what facilities should look like. Does it have to be large facilities with a high risk of institutionalization? I don't think so. Personally, I don't think that we really need the large institutions. Do we need facilities with higher security levels? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so.
Do you know what I like about this story that you just described of following the rules because everyone else is kind of considering other people, in this case in Leira prison? That sounds very normal to me. And what I mean with that is life outside detention, something I experience personally, a lot of other people experience it. The world is experiencing it right now. If you think about all the conflicts going on, the wars, the effects of climate change, for example, is we all have very different experiences of life. They're very subjective. They're all relative. Some are going through much harder things than others, but that doesn't matter because to one person, they only know what they've experienced. So they will experience something in a very harsh way, but relative to someone else, you could argue, oh, it's not that bad, you shouldn't complain. And we also all have to make that exercise of considering each other and finding a way to live together in a communal way and respecting each other's experiences, but also emotions in certain situations and towards certain topics. And that's what I kind of heard as well, and I really like that example of we're also doing that in real life, so why wouldn't that work inside detention in a way that we don't need to I guess shame and name people or say, oh, you're not allowed to complain about this, but while you do that, maybe also reflect on what else is going on, and that way you create a kind of dialogue about how you can just move forward. I don't think there's one answer. I think it's always an ongoing process of figuring out how to effectively live together as a society, and I think that is something which is important, which is something which just needs to be discussed, it needs to be experienced, and people in detention should be able to participate in that instead of having a rule solely having a situation which they're just ordered by an authoritative figure to follow it, versus them also feeling what would the effect be of me acting in this way. So that's all this like accountability and responsibility, which we haven't all figured out, so it makes sense that to be honest, so that's a very hard exercise, and creating an adaptive environment to learn that I think is also a part of what detention should offer, at least, because that is, I think, a normal way of experiencing life. So I was just reflecting on that. I think we've spoken a lot about normalization, and there's lots more to talk about. I think we could spend a few more hours discussing this. I was wondering, maybe as a last kind of point, because it's already been mentioned in our conversation, but maybe it's a nice thing to end with, and also something for the audience to maybe reflect on themselves. We spoke a lot about what is normal. You spoke how the principle of normalization impacts how we think about punishment, but also how we think a society should function as a welfare state, for example. So in that, and I know it's something that we've discussed together as well, in that I hear how or what do prisons say about us as a society, and reflecting on how we organize detention, on how we do justice or also do injustice. Could it help us lead to a better more inclusive, more fair, more humane society? I think that's a very important question to reflect on. And I was, for me, I guess the most important takeaway from that is looking out. In this case, we've talked all about prison for the last, I don't know, 30 minutes, but actually looking outside of it and looking at what do we do in society, what is normal there, what do we find acceptable, and is there maybe some things that we just need to change there, especially dealing with the population who ends up in prisons, who are often already targeted throughout society. They're in a more vulnerable position because society and underlying inequalities have put them there, reflecting on what do we need to change.
I think normalization, well, I already explained it a little bit, but like normalization can be seen as a mirror. You're reflecting things into prison or into detention, but that also means there's limits on what you're reflecting are the conditions outside prison. So you're in a way limited to if your mental health care outside prison isn't functioning the way it should, or if you're stigmatizing people outside or excluding people outside, normalization is not going to solve this. What can happen is that you look at the prison conditions or the prison population, and there you can easily identify things that are going wrong in society, because who's ending up in prison that shouldn't be there says a lot about how is society functioning and where are the things that should improve, or the services or whatever in society, like if we're not providing people the right mental health care or residential care for people that really need it, sooner or later prison will be expected to solve this. So I think normalization can really help in seeing this way as a mirror, also being confronted as we like to see ourselves, or in Belgium, as the strong human rights. We're the center of Europe, Brussels is there, but when looking at our prisons, is overcrowded prisons where it's so inhumane conditions. I think we should also use this as a mirror to look into society and see what is going on there, so that we end up with these prison conditions that are legally should be normalized conditions, but we can't expect the prison to solve. I mean, the prison is not a place to solve all society's issues. So I think you're very right that there's always this link, but doesn't mean that we should only look in one direction. We shouldn't only look at the prisons or trying to reform the prisons so that everything gets solved. Let's look in both directions, and let's make sure that it all makes sense together, and that we have realistic expectations of what detention can do and what other systems should do, and try to approach the problems that we see there in a way that, again, is holistic and makes sense in a society, which doesn't make it more easy, but I think in the long term this is the way to go.
Yeah, and it's something we have to do. That was in the very beginning of this podcast. It is something all of us have to do as a society.
Yes.
Thanks for tuning in while we talked Rescaled. We hope today's episode has inspired you to think differently about incarceration and the possibilities for positive change in our communities. To learn more about Rescaled and our mission to support the use of detention houses, visit our website at www.rescale.org or follow us on social media for the latest updates. Be sure to follow along for more thought-provoking discussions and join us as we sit down with our next guest and continue to explore the path towards building communities that are safe, inclusive, and sustainable. Please also do feel encouraged to reach out to us because we would love to hear your thoughts on shaping the future of detention. Let's keep talking, let's keep listening, and let's keep pushing for a justice system that truly serves all. This is Noa Shoshan signing off for Let's Talk Rescaled.